So the Consumers Affairs Ministry sent notices to Amazon and Flipkart on October 16th for not displaying the country of origin next to some of the product listings. Now, this follows consumer protection e-commerce rules, which were notified earlier this year, which requires e-commerce companies to display the country of origin alongside product listings and also reveal the parameters that go behind determining product listings on their platforms. Remind you, the enforcement of these rules themselves coincide with a ban on several apps of Chinese origin, including TikTok, following the skirmishes between India and China at the border. To discuss about this particular issue, I have with me Rahul Narayan, who is an advocate on record in the Supreme Court of India, to discuss about the ministry's latest directive and just to understand in general about the feasibility of this particular mandate. Rahul, welcome to the interview. Thanks for speaking to me. I think the first and the biggest question that arises out of all of this is, what do you think exactly is the intent behind this particular mandate? I mean, this has already been there in the metrology rules, but what do you think is the intent of sort of enforcing it now?
See, the fact of the matter is that this has been discussed over some period of time now. So, and the rules, of course, were implemented a couple of months ago. And last month, again, they implemented some more rules on how a country of origin is to be determined for under free trade agreements. Now, the thing is that the reason for this implementation, I think it might be back to the early part of the summer and the anti-China sentiment. And that, of course, coupled with the fact that standard retailers are, of course, they've always had a bit of a grudge against the e-tailers, and that is part of the reason why they are probably being pushed for it. Although, frankly, from a constitutional perspective, it's difficult to see why Amazon and Flipkart have to comply with this, and not the small retailer as well. This is ideally be applicable across the board. I mean, if you buy something from a shop, a corner shop, that should also be displaying for the same reason. Now that said, this was at least my point of view then was, and that remains, is that the fact that this was not thought through completely and not thought through in a completely fair way, because it is almost impossible at this point in time to implement this in any clear way, because this it doesn't take into account how international trade works, and it doesn't take into account also the fact that economies of scale sometimes make it absolutely redundant for them to do this. Other countries which have implemented such rules make large exceptions to to these rules, which make them more easily implementable and stuff. Over here, this seems to be across the board, so that seems to be a cause of concern as well.
Rahul, actually, that was going to be my second question about the general feasibility of this entire thing. I mean, you consider you're an e-commerce company. This, I assume, I mean, it's definitely more work than they used to have before. So, just how feasible do you think this particular mandate is in terms of compliance burden? Basically, how much of a workload is going to add to the work of these e-commerce platforms?
Okay, I've written on this exact point as well. I think this will impose a very heavy burden of compliance, and that also will be very difficult for Indian importers typically to comply. But let's say, for example, that you are one of those a seller on Amazon or on maybe on Flipkart or whatever. The fact of the matter is, you are not like a large scale importer, or you're not a person with any kind of leeway over the person who you're importing from. Like, if for example you are, say, if you are importing water bottles from wherever, the point is that whoever your supplier is, you're going to have to go with whatever he actually supplies. It's not, international trade doesn't work in the way that you go to the shops in, say, Florence or something, and get them to make those bottles for you and you import them. No, you find a reseller, right? So the chain of making this starts very early on, and the Indian importer is unlikely to have the kind of leverage to make sure that it gets done from the start, at least in the short term. In the long term, of course, everybody goes where the markets are, etc., etc. And what I was trying to highlight in all of my articles is that this is how to determine a country of origin is also itself a very complicated and a very difficult question. You can't easily do it like this, because the different portions are manufactured in different places, and it's not that that everything is done in one place, where the Indian importer probably just likely to say, yeah, I have imported this from Dubai, so it's made in Dubai, right? Whereas it could actually be made in China in any case. But like I said, this will be very difficult for them to comply. And secondly, so supposing I'm an Indian importer, all I can do is tell the guy who I'm importing from, please comply with this. If he doesn't comply, it's not that I have any great danda over him, right? So in the end, this will have to the only way to deal with this fairly is that there will be the burden of proof for the Indian importer will have to be a best efforts to comply kind of imposition. If the person who you import from is going to lie to you or something, how are you going to ever find out the truth? So to that extent, yes, it's going to be difficult. And this, of course, increased compliance time, increased compliance cost will also mean increased prices.
So you're basically suggesting that a potentially harsh implementation of this mandate is perhaps not the right way to go ahead with this, if at
It's
all.
completely the wrong way to go with this, in my opinion. You have to be far more careful about
Hmm.
implementing this. And this kind of I don't know. It also depends on the kind of product it is. For if for example for a larger and more expensive product, like for example say a television set, it may make some sense to do it from an economic perspective because the price difference might not be massive. But if it is something small, like say a pencil or a rubber, to comply with for each tiny rubber to have a made in Taiwan kind of thing, is this the compliance cost will be so high that the cost of the product itself will go up. So products which you don't manufacture in India, one, products which are necessary and which are important to have cheap, two. Both of these should be sort of exempt. And thirdly, of course, goods which are when you import when the number of things which you are importing is much fewer or much smaller in number. That should be another kind of area where there should be an exemption granted.
That was actually, so I think exceptions perhaps would be very important if this sort is, I mean, it's very clear the government is actually very willing and very intent on doing this now. So I think what kind of exemptions do you think should ideally be given to these companies to sort of be on the safer side of this?
Well, one, I think that they need to give a little more time for compliance, and you shouldn't send legal notices based on the fact that Diwali is coming and the trader groups are on your case to please do something to ensure that everybody doesn't buy from Amazon because in the COVID period no one is going to get out of their house. So that is probably not a fair way for them to go about things. So one is of course the time. Secondly, like I was suggesting, it depends a lot on the price of the product in question. When for extremely cheap consumer products or products which the Indian government feels are important in terms of they should be cheaply available and widely available. For those products, they should ideally not be this. They shouldn't put this at all. For the more expensive products, yes. For goods which compete directly with Indian goods, yes. But I would much rather that you have a kind of a kind of talk, a kind of discussions between importers and in various sectors and the government. Like take for example COVID kits, right? If the government wants to import a lot of COVID kits these days, which and it's extremely urgent, then maybe insisting on compliance with something like rules of origin might not be the smartest way to go about things. And this kind of thing, it takes time. Now, I am adding a country of origin certainly aids consumer choice, and it's very important for things like anti-dumping as well. Like if you know, for example, that all these products are manufactured in China or in Taiwan or something, and they are dumping their goods in India, then Indian manufacturers can and should take action against them. To that extent, there is a strong economic justification for this, and also a moral one, that why should you not know where you're buying things from? But you have to implement this sort of thing a little more carefully. You cannot do it in an emotional manner, if you know what I mean. It has to be done with a fair bit of thought and with a perspective of how it's going to impact industry. Now, this is in my opinion, and at this point of time, this is when our economy have actually contracted by a large number of things to make things more expensive or to impede processes or consumer products right now is not going to be wise. What this may entail is that you have fewer products, right? So the consumer in the short run, the choice is going to go down, the prices will go up. I don't know if it's smart or worthwhile to do this unless it's done in a particular way.
Rahul, also, I'm alluding to an earlier point that you had raised about how do you even begin deciding where exactly a product is made? I mean, how do you form the basis of it? I mean, we live in a globalized economy. We have sort of borderless trade, etc. An iPhone is designed in California but made in China. So how do you? I mean, for instance, with an iPhone, probably it would be easier to sort of give it a country of origin. But there are so many electronics specifically which are imported from China and Taiwan, etc. There are certain products which have Chinese material at their heart, but they're branded as Indian products. For instance, a lot of Indian mobile phones right now. So how do you even go about solving for this particular problem?
See, the way they solve this in free trade agreements, you see what happens is that we have free trade agreements with many countries, and to make sure that only those countries get the benefit of that, there's usually a formula. Like for example, in the India-Singapore treaty or in the India-Japan treaty, the kind of economic effort which has to go into that country is say about 35 to 40% or 60% or something. So if you can show that 60% of the product, for example, is made in Singapore, or 35% of the product is made in Japan, then that is made in Japan for that reason. Which is why I said that definitions in this are so subjective. So what the European Union does and what America does, for example, is that for of course you have one rule for the free trade agreement countries. You have another rule for country with whom there is no agreement. Like for example, India and the US right now, to my knowledge, there is no current free trade agreement. So for there is a set of guidelines and rules laid down by the American customs to determine when a product is like this or not. Europe has pretty much the same thing. So you need to determine paragraph. Maybe you should take out rules which say that okay, 60% or 70% of the product should be manufactured in one particular country for it to say this, right? And but then, like I said, a lot of this depends upon the transparency in the industry also itself, which is always, of course, a good thing. But like take for example, I mean, I don't mean to draw attention to any particular brands, but let's say I have a certain brand of headphone, which is European in origin, but I believe that my particular model, according to the internet, which is of course not a reliable source of information, according to the internet, it may have been made in China, but this brand is never going to say it was made in China, right? So to that extent, also there is a further problem. They are going to pretend, although they don't lie and say that they are made in Germany, but the fact of their silence is that they are probably made in China. Now the thing could be the brand would just say, "I'm sorry, I'm not going to say made in China to my product. I'm not going to sell to you at all." So the product, the consequence of that is maybe that headphones may not be available to Indians anymore. So there are all kind of small factors to be considered as well. It's not as straightforward as I want to boycott all Chinese products. Therefore, it shouldn't work like that.
Also, Rahul, another point you had earlier raised is about the distinction that the government has drawn between e-tailers and brick and mortar shops, even though both of them essentially sell the same kinds of products, but definitely originating from similar countries. But this mandate has essentially been imposed on e-tailers, and ironically, people who run brick and mortar shops have become the biggest critics of platforms like Amazon and Flipkart. So how do you think the government, and also it shouldn't be remiss on all of us that we are entering peak festive season, we have Diwali and a bunch of other festivals lined up. So this is probably a time when there is a lot of business even for brick and mortar shops. So why do you think the government has taken this discriminatory stance, first of all, and is it even justified to take that stance right now?
From uh, uh, from a legal perspective, I cannot see any distinction between a brick and mortar shop and e-tailers with regard to this particular thing. If the object is consumer choice, then consumer choice is equally the same whether you buy it from an e-tailer or you buy it from a retailer. Which is why I think if retailers want to use this as a stick to hit the e-commerce company, it's rather short-sighted of them. Because in the long run, I don't know how they can be justified in that. I mean, just look at it like this: if you import, when you go to China, a lot of remember, I mean, I remember that a lot of small Indian manufacturers or small Indian shops would simply go to China with empty suitcases and come back with like heaps of toys or something, and then sell them in their shops or sell them on the street side or whatever, right? So why should they be exempt from the same thing? Whereas if you sell the same thing on an Amazon website, you have to supposed to display, but if you sell them physically or not, so that doesn't really make any sense, right? So to that extent, there is no logical distinction between them. The law as it currently stands, of course, is different for under the e-commerce websites, although under the Legal Metrology Act, which also has such a requirement, it's the same. I think in the long term, it's going to have to be the same for everybody. I mean, that is the way the law works. You can't just have laws for particular industries based on this, and particularly when the logic is consumer choice and transparency, that is applicable across the board. So to that extent, yes, I think it should be applicable to everybody or to nobody. It is unfair to put it on one person like this. And like I said, I mean, at Diwali time to do it is the short-term consideration for the physical retailers is that people will not be able to buy from Amazon and they will come to our shops and buy. But this is, I mean, of course, fine. I mean, everybody is in a bad way economically, but this is hardly a smart way to go about things, right? I mean, so like I said, it should be applicable across the board. And to start it at this time might not be wise, because if this impacts shopping is, I think, I mean, again, shopping is good for the economy, whether at this time, whether you buy from Amazon or whether you buy from from your neighborhood shop, it's good for the economy. So from the government's point of view, I think it makes far more sense to not insist on this right now, if this stops sales. But I find right now, go ahead, but fine, we'll give you 3 months or 4 months more time. Earlier that was the understanding. I thought they were giving time to comply.
So what you're essentially suggesting is this could potentially that this could potentially be kind of a self goal, in that, I mean, we see that the economy clearly is contracting, and then to bring in these rules which on the face of it also show that the government doesn't really trust. I mean, I think from my conversation with people who've been advocating against this, several trade unions. So when you put forth the point about why should this not be applicable to you because you essentially sell the same stuff. So their argument there is that you come to a shop, you're talking to a physical person there, and you can sort of inquire about the product, and that person is going to give you all the necessary information. So that is sort of your final place where you get to know a lot about your product, whereas on e-commerce websites you don't have that kind of transparency. So how do you even begin countering these kinds of comments then? I mean, you'd for a second think that, okay, I mean, I think you have a point here. Like, I can clearly ask the person selling me stuff about where this product was made. But I don't think they would be very good at knowing it to begin with, first of all.
And would
Uh,
they be truthful about it? I mean, you've heard the
exactly.
jokes about second-hand car salesman, right? I mean, the
Yeah.
truth of the matter is that, and let me put it like this, okay? Like, when I was much younger, my shirt size is 38, and all Indian manufacturers used to make shirts starting with 39. So every time I used to go to a shop, they would always say, "भाई साहब, ये तो 38 पर तो शर्ट बनती ही नहीं." बनती नहीं है. I said, I wear this all the time, so I know that XYZ or ABC brand makes it, so I know it exists. Tell me if you don't have it, it's fine. I'll go somewhere else. But no, every single shop I had to have this 20-minute discussion whether they make size 38 shirts or not. So the fact of the matter is that if the e-commerce websites have put something in writing, which you can capture on a screenshot, and at least you know that this is what they have said. Whereas the salesman may say whatever they want about anything which you want, and later on they will say, "Oh, I never said that," or "You misunderstood," things like that. Anyway, that's of course a joking kind of point, but I don't think it's a particularly a smart way to go about it, because again, do you really think that the shopkeeper's assistants will know about the original products? It's a bit bizarre, no? I mean, and then again, if you have got it from the fact that you have got it from Dubai doesn't mean it's made in Dubai, no? So that's the thing. The shopkeeper may know, okay, I went to Dubai and I bought this from so and so place in Dubai, but the actual fact, whether it came over there from Oman, or whether it came from Iran, or whether it came from Kazakhstan, God alone knows, right? So again, I don't think it's a complete or in fact even a remotely serviceable answer to this.
One last question, and this question particularly comes because this mandate is being increasingly enforced by the Consumers Affairs Ministry, which sort of looks into the aspect of consumer protection. So, from that particular lens of this, how do you think that showing country of origin next to a product listing is a consumer protecting move? Or do you think it outweighs the political side of it, sort of outweighs it at this point in time? Or do you genuinely think that this actually has some ramifications for consumer protection as well?
I think it does, and I think in the long term, I have always supported this. The fact of the matter is that I am, if I have any problems with this, it is in terms of implementation. In terms of an idea, I think increased clarity is always good, and this, more information helps making a more informed choice. Whether or not you think it's smart to boycott Chinese products is one thing, but for example, apartheid South Africa is an example of a place where an economic blockade did have a particular kind of impact, right? So to that extent, yes, of course it matters whether if goods are manufactured in, say, the Palestinian territories, or whether they're manufactured in Israel proper. I think that the fact of a certain kind of clarity does aid in consumer choice, and it's very important. Don't forget, our freedom movement had Swadeshi as its primary goal, and Gandhiji and all burnt those piles of foreign clothes and whatnot, isn't it? So I certainly support consumer choice. Normally, it may not matter whether a product is made in Romania or whether it's made in Kazakhstan. But yes, sometimes it certainly may matter if a product is made in POK and the market is made in Pakistan, for example. So people may have issues about that. And also, I mean, of course, we have something in law called geographical indications. Like if you buy champagne, it has to be made in the Champagne area of France. Everywhere else, it's just sparkling wine. Or a Banarsi sari is made in Banaras and it cannot be made in Lucknow. You know, so there's also that kind of aspect. So I think, yes, certainly it aids consumer choice. It aids consumer action, and to that extent, it is a sound and a solid move, which is done pretty much in every other country in the world anyway. It's just a matter of how it is to be implemented, the time frame into which it is implemented, and what are the rules and exceptions which you make for it.
Rahul, I couldn't have summed it up better than myself than what you just did. That perhaps this does definitely have some benefits for consumer protection, as you rightly said. But I think what we should be cautious about is sort of not to go a sudden and very harsh on it. Maybe give them enough time to sort of comply with these rules, and if they and I think also to eventually apply similar rules on retail shops like brick and mortar shops as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Sorry,
Rahul, thanks. Yeah,
one more thing which I think
sure, please.
I should have mentioned is also
Mhm.
that apart from consumer protection, there's also a very important interest in for customs and for the taxman, because like I said, breaking the rules of free trade agreements is extremely important as well. Like for example, people shouldn't take advantage of the India-Singapore treaty and import products which are made in Indonesia or Brunei through that. So to that extent, that is also a fairly important point. Yeah. Okay,
Thanks for
then.
highlighting that, Rahul. And thanks a lot for speaking to us. This was a great interview.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for speaking to us. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Bye bye.
Bye bye.